Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to Predicting Event Revenue During the Pandemic, Why Forecasting is Important. I'm going to go ahead and close this opening poll right now and share the results, and then get us started. All right, so there are the answers to the polls. So Turnkey tries to bring you information that can help you and your organization be more successful, and that goes double during the current COVID-19 pandemic. This afternoon, we are addressing how you can forecast your event revenue in the face of what is likely postponements or on-the-ground events turned virtual. Before I introduce our speakers, just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording this webinar, and we will share that recording as well as the PowerPoint deck with you tomorrow. And we will also be posting it on our COVID-19 resource page. So you don't have to worry about taking notes or screenshotting. We're going to share all these resources with you. We also want this to be an interactive discussion, so we will be answering all of your questions. The best way to ask questions is with the Q&A function. That's either at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. When you put the questions in there, everyone can see them and we can make sure that we answer them in order. Later on in the presentation, we might actually be asking not for questions, but for some opinions or reactions, and the Q&A icon is the right place to do that as well. Okay, for our speakers, first we have Katrina VanHuss, who is the CEO of Turnkey. She has been developing revenue programs for organizations like the American Lung Association, the Arthritis Foundation, and March of Dimes since 1989 when she founded Turnkey. Her client successes and her dedication to research have made her a sought-after speaker. She also regularly shares her wit and business experiences blogging for Nonprofit Pro and is the co-author of the 2017 book, Dollar Dash, The Behavioral Economics of Peer-to-Peer Fundraising. Next, we have Vickie LoBello, who is the lead strategist at Turnkey. She has been working in the nonprofit sector in senior leadership roles for most of her career. Her passion is helping nonprofits build to the future state they want to achieve. She has expertise in all areas of nonprofit fundraising, operations, and organizational development. She has had the opportunity to implement many changes within the organizations where she has worked, either as a leader or as a consultant. And last but not least, we have Ryan Grosenick, who is a senior data analyst at Turnkey. Before becoming a professional Excel junkie, Ryan graduated from Virginia Tech in 2016 with a BS in physics. While at school, he worked as a research assistant at the Center for Soft Matter and Biologic Physics at Virginia Tech to develop a computation biophysics model to replicate filament assembly. This is where he learned to organize, prepare, and drive insight from big data efficiently and quickly. Now he is bringing the analytics tools he learned in the hard sciences to the nonprofit space. For the past 3 years, he has developed comprehensive systems of analysis to understand participant engagement, evaluate event performance, and predict future behavior to drive more engagement and fundraising for nonprofits across the nation. Katrina?
Hello, everyone. Just with me, Holy Mother of God. Yes, 75% of you have very low confidence in forecasting, and we understand why. I want to apologize ahead of time because this is my new life. I've got one guy on a ladder screening in my porch because you can do that during lockdown, apparently. Who knew? My daughter will undoubtedly come through here because there's something about webinars with hundreds of people that she really likes. And the dog will undoubtedly make a showing as well. So I'm sure your life is exactly like that as well. So anyway, what we're going to do today is talk about this calculator that we built in a much happier time. We built it for, a time period when we would be looking at ways to increase revenue and looking at the relative impact of increasing participation versus retention. But now we're using it for this. We had to go in and change the language on the calculator and make it a little more realistic to the time. So we did that. When I asked Vickie, hey, do this webinar with me, her first answer was, you've got Ryan, you don't need me. He knows how to work the calculator. And then she came with me and said, yes, I understand the outcome of the calculator is what I'll need to talk about. So thank you, Vickie, for coming into the darkness. I know this is a hard one. really. But what we're talking about is the problems that we see on screen, that many of us are having a really hard time forecasting, and in a situation with no precedent. So with that, we are going to get started. Vickie, take it away.
Wanted to start with why forecast. Even in normal times, most nonprofits use forecasting. It's a useful tool in any circumstance. It can help you to plan for your budget, your resources, your staff's program of work, and of course revenue. So forecasting is important, and it may be tougher at this moment in time, but hopefully you do it all the time, which will build confidence. So the questions, the top questions for-profits and nonprofits ask in preparation for forecasting are there changes to the marketplace? Have your customer behaviors changed? Are your resources changing, or could they change? In this moment in time, I think the answer to all of those questions is yes, which is very unusual. Our customer journey has taken a huge detour. The best anyone can do in this situation is to use your knowledge and expertise to make an educated guess on the impact. And of course, Ryan is going to help us with the calculator and other tools. Our goal is to gather our thoughts and create a framework to achieve what is possible in the months and year ahead. The forecasting will serve to affirm or show the need to pivot our approach as the environment changes, which is my way of saying what we're going to help you to set up is benchmarks that you can keep an eye on. And should you be excelling in those benchmarks, you can, of course, forecast at a higher level, or if those benchmarks are not coming together the way you had hoped they would do, then you'll know sooner rather than later how your revenue is going to pan out. This is our sort of Zen, as Katrina said, as I entered into this, I was like, okay, this isn't an exact science at this moment in time. Our goal is to create our playbook, identify ways to create the field of play, and focus for your staff and volunteers. Forecasting is squishy. So Ryan will tell us that if we have 5 years of good data and there's no significant changes in the marketplace, we can, from a fairly accurate way, predict the future and what it will be. In this moment, we need to let ourselves off the hook a little for clean predictions and embrace the squishy. It won't be an exact science this year.
Okay, so this is where I start talking. We're gonna get real technical. Well, not real technical. We'll get technical enough, but first thing I want to talk about is the inspiration for this whole thing. So back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a guy named Enrico Fermi. So he's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He worked on the Manhattan Project, and he did a lot of work for quantum mechanics. He's a really big figure in physics. But he also had this interesting quirk where he tried to solve extremely complex problems with as little calculation as he could possibly muster up. And he was able to do this by making a lot of good assumptions and with little to no data. So the most famous example was they were testing the atom bomb. And when they were testing the atom bomb, he dropped a piece of paper right as the bomb went off, and he was able to calculate approximately how much energy that bomb gave off by just watching how far the paper moved from the shock wave. All from using very little data, good approximations and good assumptions on the back of a napkin. So we're trying to do the same thing. So like Vickie said earlier, to make really good predictions, you need 5 years of data, and everything needs to be the same year over year, and et cetera, et cetera. And we're very obviously not in that space anymore due to COVID. So, predictions are kind of up in the air. So we wanted to do something in the same spirit as Enrico Fermi, just use a few variables with some good assumptions to get us in the ballpark of what we expect to happen to revenue, okay? So the way we're gonna do this, we're gonna demonstrate some calculations based on an event of about 2,000 participants, we're going to assume about $150,000 revenue, again, in a normal year, to see what would happen given a big change in revenue and a big change in retention, because returners are your most valuable participants. They fundraise the most. So anything that happens to participation, it happens to returners as well, and that'll change your overall revenue. So we're going to set this up with a best, middle, and worst case scenario, and then we're going to do a demo. We're going to do a live demo of the actual calculator. So again, using best case scenario, 2,000 participants, $150,000 in revenue. We're going to assume a benchmark retention rate of about 23%. That's the average across organizations we've seen. We're also going to assume no registration fee. So absolute best case scenario we're going to throw out there is that nothing happens to participation at all. Again, best case scenario, we're not, that the stars align and whatnot. So if we have no change in participation, and maybe we've stewarded our returners enough in such a way that retention is higher, we might actually be able to get ahead a little bit. So about $2,300, a 1.6% increase for that $150,000 in revenue. So if everything goes right, maybe we can get out of this with a little tiny bit more money. Now, we're not saying this is going to happen. This is our best case scenario. Vickie, I think this was, maybe events that moved to the fall and whatnot.
Yeah, we didn't tackle all the variables. We'll talk a bit about that, but we were assuming under this scenario, again, using our squishy qualitative, that in this moment in time, we were providing some extra love and connectivity to our retainers, that there were some extra elements built in, that whether staff and volunteers were reaching out and building relationships, which is why the plus 1%. We know that doesn't happen magically or without effort, but again, best case scenario, thought we'd have one at the top end of the spectrum, and then the other two coming your way next.
Yep, so middle case scenario, this is probably probably in the ballpark of the most likely. So again, same event size, same revenue, same retention. So middle case scenario, COVID hits and we take a 10% drop in participation. But with this drop in participation, the distribution of returners and new participants changes a bit, so that we have, let's say, 2% more returners, or maybe we've done things in such a way that retention increases a little bit. Now, net revenue is still going to drop by about $10,000. That's a 7.2% drop. However, that bump in retention, that plus 2%, actually saved 3% in revenue, because if participation dropped 10%, we can extrapolate that revenue will drop about 10% as well. But that change in returners actually helps mitigate 3% of that revenue decline. So,
and Ryan, oh, sorry.
No.
This hypothesis was based on, if some of you have been on some of our earlier webinars, in times of crisis, the people who are most engaged, who have shown that they love our organizations the most, are more likely to stay. And those that are not as heavily engaged are more likely to leave. So that's part of why you see participation dropping 10% and retention coming up higher, again, leaning into the ongoing new engagement opportunities and outreach to team captains.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So returners help hold the line despite this drop in participation. Now, this is a middle case. We're now going to look over worst case scenario. Again, same exact event size, revenue, etc. But let's say participation drops 25%. Let's also say that retention also drops to, maybe this organization, this example here, they didn't talk to their returners right, or did something or another, retention drops 5%. The net revenue now drops $46,000, which is a 30% decline in revenue. So in this worst case scenario, the revenue is actually dropping faster and more than the participation drop, which is absolute worst case scenario. Now we're going to assume, at least for this particular event, what's going to actually happen is going to happen somewhere in the middle. So that middle case scenario. Vickie, did you want to talk about the worst case at all?
No, let's go to the overview and we'll talk
Gotcha.
more about that.
So just looking at the calculator, calculations, best case scenario, nothing changes and you don't have to touch your retention very much. You might still come out just a little bit ahead. Again, best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you're losing participants, you're losing returners, and revenue decline is faster than participation decline. So ideally, what we expect, what we most expect to happen, I should say, is somewhere in the middle. So maybe there's going to be a drop in participation, but algorithmically, if we up the retention rate a bit, it should help stem the bleeding a bit.
And I'll just add, this is a fairly simple example. It's a single event, not a series of events. We're not taking into account the other variables, which could be the event was in the spring and moved to the fall, or this event is virtual, or fall event is happening on the same date and same location. All the different things that can go into it. And again, these numbers that Ryan and I worked on together are really based on our educated guess of this event, what could happen and what we think will happen based on past trends and based on the level of engagement of the participants.
So Vickie, if I'm taking my event from an on-the-ground event to a virtual event, and how would you guess the participation is going to vary based on that in terms of something that's happening near term versus long term? So in 3 weeks versus next fall.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer a couple of different ways, which help me to make this not so confusing. So I'll use one example from a client that had a spring event, and the event was supposed to happen right at the time that they had to cancel the event. So most of the money was already banked, and they did a celebration event. In that case, that virtual event performed very nicely because they'd already banked a lot of the revenue relative to that event. If another event, let's say it was much further into the season and they hadn't really truly started doing their fundraising, and the only difference, and I'm going to use a little bit of time here to explain the difference. So some people, when they say a virtual event, are making available the fundraising pages, but not really significant changes otherwise. In that scenario, if major fundraising hasn't happened, we just launched fundraising pages and didn't improve the customer experience in some way, I would say you should probably look at a 25% decline in participation at least. And then of course, if you're able to, all those other variables in the equation, if you're able to create a new experience or a new engagement strategy, those numbers could improve.
So if I were lobbying for some space maybe on my revenue budget, if I were a staff person, and when I first go to leadership and I say, this is what's going to happen based, this is our best guess of what's going to happen based on the elements we have in place. We have no online, no virtual community. We've got to stand one up. We have nothing, the constituent experience will be poor because of that. So I do it. And then I react, then I could go back and do it again, right? And actually
Yes.
make adjustments as I layer in new things to build community, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, great point. As part of this, what we're recommending, whatever your variables are, that you lay out your best, middle, and worst based on those variables. And then you create benchmarks for retention for all three of those categories, which is how you can react in real time. So let's say you have your best case scenario is the 25% or whatever the number is, and that means you have to get commitments for 50 team captains to come back again. As your staff and volunteers are making outreach to those captains and getting a sense of the lay of the land, you can keep records and make sure you're able to update your forecast as you go in real time.
And if you had to make choices, this is a hard question. If you had to make choices, I'm going to build an online community, I'm going to spend all my energy and money there, or I'm going to just go to my high fundraising participants from last year. What do you do first?
You have to do both. I'm sorry, I think it is a hard question. I think you can go to your top fundraisers and try to engage. What you said earlier, I want to touch on. A lot of us are talking about having a virtual experience or building a virtual community. Most of our communities have never engaged with us in that way. unless you already have a community that engages in a virtual space a lot, then you'll be able to pivot very quickly. But if most of those folks are getting together historically, physically, are doing things by phone, are not engaging that way, there's going to be some time before you can build that virtual community.
Yeah, and that, people, is how I got Vickie to do this webinar, because she said, but wouldn't it be great if we all learn how to have a virtual community?
It would be great. I do think the future is going to be innovative and different, and we are going to learn from one another and not reinvent the wheel as we do in the nonprofit space a lot. But I think there is a lot of space in the new world about how we can create virtual communities and new opportunities.
So along the same lines, this question came in through the chat, but if you guys could use the Q&A, that'd be great. Volunteer leadership is, we had a webinar a couple of days ago. This person wants to know, what impact does volunteer leadership have on this situation?
Personally, I would say significant impact, because of course, even with your staff resources being deployed differently, those relationships, those boots on the ground, those folks that know people in that community and are being impacted by your cause are your best advocates. So they're the ones who can bring people back and say things that we as staff may have trouble saying, like, I lost my job and I'm still going to do this thing. Those sorts of conversations come across in a really positive way from volunteers.
Very nice. Thank you.
So just as a quick recap of the calculator itself, this calculator is going to, remember, we're doing this in the spirit of Enrico Fermi. It's going to get you in the ballpark of what we expect, how we expect the revenue to change, given a change in overall participation and a change in retention. So, instead of going into a budgeting meeting with nothing, you all have at least something to work with. It also can help you determine what kind of retention you would need in order to mitigate revenue decline, or if you're lucky enough, even break even. And it can help you understand how much your returners are likely contributing to your overall revenue. I've been doing this for 3 years now, and returners have pretty much every single time proven that they are the most valuable. So we can put dollar signs on that with the calculator itself. So we have 5 minutes. So I'll take 1 or 2 examples, and we can do this live. That sounds good to y'all.
Do you want somebody to queue up an example of something they'd like to look at, Ryan?
That'd be perfect. So I'll first put in the values we had for our middle case, right? So 2,000, this is a calculator, first and foremost. You enter your participation and revenue if you know your retention rate off the top of your head, and also the changes. So we'll do 2,000 here, $150,000 in revenue, and that was 1.5 million. We're going to say no registration fee. This does change the calculations, just FYI, if you do have a registration fee. We're going to leave retention rate blank. That's going to default to the benchmark of 23%. Our anticipated change for the middle case was a negative 10% drop, and our change in participant retention was 2. So once you put all this in, you hit calculate, and the results will fill in. So this has a lot more than what we showed, but what we did have up was this block right here. So the calculated net change in revenue was negative 10,770. That's a negative 7.2% drop. And it also has some other stuff. So what if comparison? So what if we change the retention here? And so this is the value would be if it was a negative 1% retention. This is the value would be if it was 5% retention. So even a 5% increase in retention wouldn't quite break even for a negative 10% drop in participation. So do either of y'all have numbers for me?
Do one for the 5K folk out there. Let's say we've got 1,000 people and we're raising $50,000, and that will be the fundraising number, right? Not the registration number.
Right.
We are going to have a registration amount. So if you're doing this example on the calculator, you would need to add in your registration revenue. Mm-hmm. And retention rate's going to be 75%?
75%. Let's, dang, that's really high.
That's best in class, I'm afraid.
It's 5K though. And well, we're going to lose 50%. Well, because people can't run together and we're going virtual, we're going to lose a lot more.
Yeah.
So we're going to only get 20%. I'm going to get 20% this year because everybody's got to run their own track and report virtually, right?
Okay, so negative 80 here. Any retention increase or decrease?
Let's see, Vickie. If I'm a 5K-er, I'm there more for the activity than the mission. My retention is going to suffer more, right?
Yep. Yep. And Ryan, we have a question from the group about sponsorship and reg fees. Do we have an opportunity to adjust those numbers based on virtual, to put in minus numbers on reg and sponsorship?
For this calculator, it does not take into account sponsorship. This is just peer-to-peer fundraising, and you can put in registration fees into this dollar amount if you want. This right here, this calculated field right here, this changes the retention distribution and the typical retention distribution.
Okay.
So it's 23% for a event without a registration fee, 30% for one with a registration fee. This is a very extreme example.
Take another one. Go ahead. Do something.
Okay.
But our retention is probably going to go down more than a typical walk environment, right? Because
yes,
you're going to lose all the activity people.
Yep.
Well,
we have one.
Yeah. So let's do 40,000 participants or $40,000. Let me put that in there.
625 participants.
5, looking at losing half the people, so that's a negative 50% drop. Registration fee, let's leave the retention rate where it is, and let's say a 2% increase in retention just to see what happens. Okay. So looking at this, anticipated participants, it's halved, 312 participants, 30% retention rate. The returner average would be around $113, the new participant average at 42. So that's a really, really close looking thing. Calculated net change is negative 19,559, so that's a 50% drop in revenue. So if we look down here at the bottom, if we bump it up to 5% change in retention, it's a negative 18,000, which is a negative 47. So it's at this rate, it's going to be really hard for the retention to bump up the revenue decrease.
Ryan, remind me what amount is the registration fee based on? When you click yes on registration fee.
So this is just if the event has a registration fee or not.
It doesn't calculate the amount of the reg fee?
Nope. So you can put in the overall revenue, because even if you're losing participants, it's still going to affect that overall revenue with or without a reg fee.
Okay.
So I'd feel free to put in just your fundraising, put in your fundraising and your reg fees, however you all want to calculate it. It'll take everything. Thank you. I hate math. This is so helpful. I'm glad I can be the bearer of numbers for you. But again, this is a starting place. So I can get you in the ballpark. Negative, for this case, negative $20,000. And then from there, y'all can go to your board meetings, whatever, to talk about it.
So Vickie, let's use this as an example. I think what we've come to is that the traditional walk crowd is going to be easier to transition in terms of their affinity to the mission and likelihood to react, but they typically have not been interacting in a virtual way, and they have no virtual community. So you're behind the 8 ball there, although you're ahead in affinity. With the 5K crowd, would you say we're behind the 8 ball because the activity is gone, and most of them, that's why they showed up? Are there any positives for the 5K crowd?
Well, I'll use a different positive if it's a bike crowd. I would say the positive transitioning to virtual is easier, what we've seen from ride events, than it is through endurance. Endurance is, you guys know, 5K and others is competitive. People like to get out and be able to do that. I've seen some do 5K really well, where they have the ability to basically set up those parameters through smart apps and that kind of thing, where you can have some competition value to it that isn't merely fundraising. So again, a lot depends on how your community engages at this point. I've seen some nonprofit clients that have some virtual interaction, that people are getting to, they're communicating that way. Unfortunately, I don't think we're as strong in the virtual community spaces our for-profit companies that we work with, Netflix, Amazon.
I think that's the lemonade. We finally are, as we said in a webinar last week, we are going to have to accept the cost of change now. And we haven't wanted to do that. So we have another question. So nice to see you all, you smart people. Hey, Becky, how are you? If you were starting a new peer-to-peer event in 2021, what would you do? Push forward, scrap it, and change strategies?
I would push forward, but I'd make sure that it had the building the virtual community aspect of it. And Katrina, feel free to weigh in here, that I do see our playing field, our strategy behind the playing field shifting. People will be worried this type of thing will happen again. And, once something happens, it becomes part of our reality moving forward.
Yeah, and I would agree, a significant modification of the playbook to ensure ourselves against something like this, and also to ensure that people have found new and different ways to entertain themselves, and they're not going to let those go. We have to stay in that game, because somebody's going to fill the space if we don't. So
we also have, did you see the other, Katrina, the other question? It's in chat. I can do it if you want.
Okay, go ahead.
Seldom have I seen sponsors ask for their money back. Usually you can renegotiate with them, ? Or can you usually renegotiate with them? I would concur. In most cases, if sponsors have already made a commitment for the year, unless they have been crippled by this situation, they are usually very connected and engaged with your organization, and may want some different ways to be recognized, since your events may not be happening, or may be happening later in the year, which may not serve their market strategy. But yes, I think it is important to go back and renegotiate whenever possible, and most do.
Ryan, I wanted you to talk about the calculator, just so that people understand what it's built on. This is built on data from whom exactly, in terms generalities, in terms of the events in the organizations?
Right, so this calculator is built off of our benchmarks. So I've got about anywhere between 1 and 5 years of data for all the organizations we work with. I average all the retention rates up. I average the amount of money returners and new participants raise. And those are kind of the backbone of the calculations here. So all this is backed up by what the work we've already been doing, and just applied algorithmically to do this math.
So I think we've made the point a couple of times that every organization is different. Your retention rate overwrites the average retention rate in the calculator, right, Ryan? So if you know your own, you put it in there.
Let's put 42% here, just to see what happens. Turner average went down. About the net change is about the same, just this huge drop. Let's do just a 10% drop. Okay, in this case, we've got, what was it, 42% retention rate, a net drop of minus $3,600. If I change this retention rate down to, let's say, 35, you can see all the numbers down here change as well. So the negative 300 or 3,400 instead of 3,600. So you can input your own retention rate if you have it on hand, but it'll use our benchmarks if you don't.
So I will say this, and Ryan and I discussed it because I was wrapping my head around how I would use this tool for a very large program. Let's say a $30 or $60 million nationwide program where half the events, are taking place or didn't take place in the spring, but the other half are happening in the fall. We understand that this tool will serve for some of that, but it may require more complex calculations. Any recommendations there, Ryan? I'm putting you on the spot because you're the analyst.
Well, if you've got, now is the time to be collecting as much data as y'all can possibly muster up, because, well, people like me, for example, can take that data at the end of the year and we can figure out the exact what's going on. Also, one thing that y'all can do is keep track of how your values are changing over time. So how your participation, fundraising, etc. really map out how those are changing right now, and segment them out by, if they're going virtual, or if they're canceled, or if they're rescheduled, etc. Map it all out, write it all down, because something like this will happen again. And next time, if we take all the data that we can get, we'll know what to prepare for, and we won't be caught as off guard as we are right now. So those are my recommendations. And, of course, at the end of all this craziness, people like me are going to be looking at this to quantify exactly what happened. So please, please, please collect as much data as you can possibly get your hands on.
It's also great for baseline. If you needed to take some of your events virtual this year, you've got a baseline for what you were able to produce in this moment, even though you may not have had a virtual community set up. And then you can build toward the growth of that as you head into next year, if you're going to repeat those same activities.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very good. All right. So this is on the website. You guys are welcome to it. We'd love to hear from you if you have trouble using it, if you have questions. As we said, there are so many variables. Each of you is unique in so many different ways. How long is it until your event or events? What is the construct of your event? Do you use volunteer leadership? So many variables. If you want to chat about them, give a yell. We'll do our best. I'll be, frank, this is a time that we're just leaning into everyone's conversation. We're trying to learn from you as rapidly as we can so that we can synthesize it and put it back out into the community. So love to hear from you, and hope this is helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm supposed to plug the other webinars. We have more. We got a couple coming up. Facebook right now, Facebook fundraising right now. We have a webinar coming up that Kelly will be promoting soon about one of the things we thought about is that we're asking people to go online who've never been online before. And some of those people are going to have accessibility issues, either due to bandwidth or due to understanding or due to the fact that they can't see that font size on your site. So we'll be bringing in an expert to talk about things like that. I think that's a couple of weeks from now, but we are looking for people with expertise on, for this new world order, to help in any way that we can. So stay tuned and we'll bring it to you. Thanks, guys. Bye.